Oh man, this is to be one of the most entertaining credit scrolls I've ever read. Any of you who own this game needs to boot it up and check it out. Well, after you're done watching the episode, of course. In fact, I'll remind you after the credits, just in case you forget. Okay, yeah, this game really uses a diametric perspective, not an isometric one, but not even my spell checker recognizes that word, so I didn't want to confuse anyone too badly. In any case, today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at SimCity 2000, the sequel to the original SimCity and a definite enhancement over the original, featuring many of the same features as before, but tons of new ones. So much so that the game is technically broken. I'm serious. While I personally enjoy SimCity 2000 more over the original, this game wasn't quite as perfectly balanced as its predecessor, which in some ways is understandable, considering the massive number of new calculations going on under the hood to make the simulation work with all the new content. Plus, since this was being made under the new software toy philosophy Maxis had going for them, there was more of an emphasis on making a fun game as opposed to one that presented a realistic challenge. And that's what you ultimately get out of this thing. SimCity 2000 is easier than its predecessor, despite being more complicated, and thus it's a lot easier to do what you want to do with it while still getting all the same simulation aspects and then some. And this is probably a big part of the reason why EA's done such a terrible job with the recent SimCity reboot. The SimCity series was never technically a game. It was a simulation in the guise of a game, meant to be played with in whatever way the end user wanted to. And nowhere is that more apparent than with the evolution of SimCity to SimCity 2000, and even to SimCity 3000 later on, which is my favorite of all the SimCity games. SimCity 2000 was created and released by Maxis in 1993 and is a one-player simulation game, though it should be noted that there was a special network edition of the game released in 1996 that was designed around having 3 players playing at once on a single map. Its graphics support is limited solely to an SVGA 640x480 256 color mode, which in 1993 was kind of a dangerous thing to do since the VESA standards were not yet widely adopted and lots of people were still stuck with non-SVGA cards. Fortunately, the game supports a massive array of sound and music devices, so at least the graphics support was the only potential hiccup people might face trying to run the game. As for its current release state, it's still commercial but really easy to obtain, just so long as you keep a few things in mind. Firstly, most copies floating around are of the Special Edition, which includes a scenario pack and the Urban Renewal Kit, which is used for editing the maps and graphics however you wish to. You can get the DOS version of the Special Edition from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com for $6. Now, some people have complained that the DOS version is inferior to the Windows version, which is true, but the Windows version can be a lot harder to get working properly, even on systems as old as Windows XP, which is probably a big part of the reason why only the DOS version is included with the GOG download. Heck, even on Windows 3.1, I remember crashing our old 486 system twice just trying to install the thing, much less play it. You can also find lots of copies floating around on Amazon and eBay, usually priced between $5 and $10 for just the game itself, or around the $20 mark if the box and manual are included. If you go for one of the floppy disk versions prior to the Special Edition, you'll need to pay attention to which platform it's for, as the game was released for a plethora of operating systems and even some consoles. The Special Edition, however, typically comes with both the DOS and Windows versions together on a single CD, though depending on which country the release came from, this may not be the case. Basically, if buying a physical copy, be sure you're getting it for the platform you want before committing to the purchase. SimCity 2000 has a lot of similarities to the original SimCity, so let's get them out of the way before we continue. The RCI gauge still exists, showing the demand levels for residential, commercial, and industrial zones. You still have those 3 basic zones. Police and fire stations work pretty much the same way they always have. You have your all-important budget screen, map overlay, and graphs to help figure out what you should be doing. Zones can only build up near roads. Power lines need to run between any buildings that aren't connected. Parks increase land values and subsequently the taxes you collect, and you can trigger disasters of various flavors if you're dissatisfied with the state of everything or just happen to be feeling malevolent at the time. Now let's talk about the differences. Perhaps the biggest difference between SimCity and SimCity 2000 is that zones are no longer simple 3x3 plots of land. You can now make your zones any size and shape you want, provided you keep a few things in mind about how zones are utilized. Firstly, zone tiles cannot grow if they're more than 3 tiles away from a road tile. So optimally, to get the most out of your zoning with the fewest roads, you don't want your zones to be more than 6 tiles wide. But keep in mind that the more roads that are within that 3 tile range, the more accessible the property in that zone tile will be, meaning Sims will have greater desire to live in those spots. Not to mention if you have too few roads, you'll get much higher traffic on those roads. Zones can also have properties of various sizes on them, either 1x1, 2x2, or 3x3, with the larger structures generating more taxes and being more efficient per tile, but requiring higher land values to get built in the first place. If you don't want the larger buildings to form because of the potential problems they may bring in, like crime or pollution, or because there's not enough space to build the bigger properties, you can simply switch from making dense zones to making light zones, which only cost half as much to do. Now, one uncommonly used feature SimCity 2000 has, partly because it can be a pain to get working properly, is the ability to convert cities from the original SimCity into the SimCity 2000 format. This comes with a myriad of potential problems given all the changes in how everything works. One of the big problems is that rail systems don't work the same way as before, and as such, properties cannot develop with rails alone. You absolutely must have roads in place. Granted, development can also extend from rail stations and subway stations, but that would make for quite an expensive and odd-looking city. The other problem is that the simulation now includes healthcare and educational aspects, which you'd have to account for ASAP after making the conversion. Healthcare in this game is fairly simple, as you just need to build hospitals and pay for them in your annual budget. Education relies on keeping a good mix of schools, colleges, libraries, and museums scattered throughout the city. Typically, you only need 1 college per several schools, and while libraries and museums help to boost the educational level of your Sims to a degree, there's no major penalties for not having them. Now, speaking of the budget, there's been a number of revamps to this. You now have advisors you can click on to get their advice on what you should do with the budget. One thing that's nice about this is that several of them, such as the fire department, healthcare, and educational advisors, will give you instant feedback as you adjust the budget that they get, and you can use the information they give you to decide on where to set your funding levels. The police advisor bases their advice on present crime levels throughout the city, so this one you'll need to put a little more guesswork into. As with the original SimCity, never ever under any circumstances reduce the transit funding. And as for taxes, once again you can go as high as 8% without triggering negative growth, but the lower you go, the more growth you will get. Typically, set taxes low when you build some new areas to get them populated as fast as possible, then raise taxes once everything's built up. One of the new screens you can access, though, are city ordinances. Now, these are basically extra rules and regulations that you can set up. And the first 4 all result in increased revenue, but usually with a negative effect. For instance, legalized gambling increases the overall crime levels throughout the city by a small amount. And it should be noted that none of the ordinances have an instant effect, and it takes a number of years for their maximum potential to be realized. All of the other ordinances, for the most part, cost money because they have a largely positive effect on their city, such as tourism advertising, which helps increase population growth, and energy conservation, which helps reduce citywide energy consumption, though also happens to be the most expensive ordinance you can pass. Declaring your city a nuclear-free zone costs nothing and has a tiny effect on growth, so it's a good one to set up very early on since chances are you won't be able to afford a nuclear power plant anyways. You can disable it later on if you decide to build one. Speaking of the power plants, this is probably the one major change that irked a lot of players. Power plants now only last 50 years before they fall apart and need to be replaced. And considering how expensive the power plants can be, it adds a sense of urgency, since it can be extremely difficult saving up enough money over the course of a decade or two to afford the replacement. I suppose the idea was to give players a reason to take out bonds, with bond payments coming out of your annual budget until they're paid off, something you could completely avoid doing in the original SimCity, but even here it's possible to avoid this, especially if you decide to start the game in a later year as opposed to 1900. You see, the game introduces various technological or sociological achievements at various points as you progress, relative to when those achievements were actually made in reality. In fact, if you start the game in 1900, you'll see subways make an appearance the very next year. They also put somewhat realistic estimates on microwave and fusion power plants, though we'll probably end up missing the mark on the microwave power plants in 7 years. Though fusion power plants by 2050, there's still hope for that one. Two power plants of note, though, are wind turbines and hydroelectric dams. Now, unlike all the other power plants you can place, these two take up only a single tile of space and will last forever, but require a bit of planning to really get going. Wind turbines need to be placed at high elevations in order to produce their maximal output of power, and you need quite a lot of them to power even a small city. Hydroelectric dams can only be placed on hillside water tiles, which you probably won't have any of in your city unless you plop them down yourself in the terrain editor prior to starting your city. So add an extra $100 to the cost of any hydro dams you want to set up. Also keep in mind that power lines on hillsides can only connect up or down the hills, not sideways, so you'll need to be a bit clever about how you connect your dams to your power grid. Now, speaking of terrain editing, you can still mold the terrain even after you've started making your city proper, but this can lead to a few issues, since adjusting the landscape is very expensive and mistakes can end up breaking some of the things you've already placed. To that end, whenever you're about to reshape the terrain in the slightest, save first. That way, if you make a mistake, you can just reload and try again. Another thing added to the game is a water system. Virtually everything you can place, short of roads, rails, and power lines, now requires water in order to achieve greater land values. To create a water system, simply build pumps, power them up, and then build pipes to connect the water they produce throughout your city. Water usage, however, can fluctuate wildly, so to mitigate this, you'll want to build water towers for storing excess water when there's a surplus, and for generating additional water when there's a deficit. You can also build water treatment facilities to reduce overall pollution levels throughout the city, and desalination plants so that any salt water in your city can be converted to fresh water for your Sims. Water pumps also function better when they're within a tile or two of a freshwater tile, while desalination plants function better the more saltwater tiles are nearby. To figure stuff like this out, you have a new query tool, which lets you look at detailed information about particular tiles or structures. Now, some of the more special structures, like City Hall and the Mayor's House, also provide some additional useful information. Don't be surprised though if this tool starts malfunctioning when your city gets really huge, because the game can only track stats for 150 special structures at a time. You also have access to various newspapers, more as your city grows, which can provide you with various information about the state of your city. I particularly like the newspapers that actually list the top 4 problems your Sims have with your city, since that's the best way to gauge what aspects of your city you should be improving upon. Now, once your population gets up to 60,000 Sims, you'll be given the opportunity to have a military base of some sort set up in your city. If you say yes, a base will be set up somewhere that you're not allowed to demolish that will bring in lots of annual revenue and possibly give you access to military units during emergencies, depending on the kind of base it is. But you don't get any choice about where it goes, plus it will generate an overall crime increase throughout the city. Saying no to a military base will actually enable a particular Easter egg that can be triggered when disasters happen, though I'm not going to spoil the details about it. The kind of base you get also depends on how hilly your terrain is and whether or not you built your city on the side of an ocean. Air Force bases are the most common, followed by Army bases, naval bases if there's plenty of oceanfront, or if you have tons of hills everywhere, you could end up with the rarely seen missile silos dotting your landscape, which unfortunately can't be used to provide military assistance during emergencies. Which kind of makes sense, as you wouldn't normally want to be dropping bombs on your Sims. And it's also a major change from the original game that kinda works and kinda doesn't. When disaster strikes, you now have the ability to direct where to send your police, fire, and military units. The number of units you can deploy of each depends on how many police and fire stations you have set up, while military stuff seems to always be limited to just 2 units whenever you have the option. If you have no police or fire protection at all, then the National Guard is sent in to help, again providing 2 military units, as military units can handle anything. Typically though, you'll use police to quell rioters or drive off aliens, while you'll use firemen to put out fires. However, there's some serious misbalancing with the disasters here, specifically with regards to how fire spreads. So long as you take care of a fire the instant it starts, you can usually put it out fast enough. However, if a fire spreads to a 2x2 or even a 3x3 building, the entire building will collapse and turn into fire tiles, making it virtually impossible to contain the resulting fires, as it will just start spreading rapidly, eating through huge chunks of your city in moments. Earthquakes are the worst for this, as they start fires in multiple locations, and you typically won't have the reflexes, time, or available units to deal with all of them. One plus side at least is that fires do not affect the zoning itself, so once a fire goes out, just clear away the rubble with the bulldozer and zoned areas can once again be built upon by your Sims. One last thing I should mention is that the game has very special structures called arcologies, which can be built once they are invented and you have a minimum population of at least 120,000 Sims. I wasn't able to get that far into the game this week since, believe it or not, building a massive city that doesn't collapse in on itself can be quite the process, even when you leave it running with disasters disabled in a stable state for a few centuries to get a ton of money. In any case, arcologies are sort of like city in a city type buildings that are massive and run themselves. They generate highly localized pollution and crime though, so having parks and police stations as close as possible to these things is a must. The whole point to gaming is to have fun, and the only reason why any of the original SimCity games are fun is because they're not trying to make you follow predetermined paths or take on realistic city planning responsibilities. Since under those circumstances, the games probably wouldn't be any fun anymore. SimCity 2000 is about building a city under a set of rules and assumptions about how city building should work and just playing around until you either get bored and set everything on fire, or end up with a few hundred launch arcologies and more money that you never know what to do with in real life. If you've never played a SimCity game before, SimCity 2000 might not be the best one to start with because of its complexity, but in the end, it's definitely more fun and a lot easier to toy around with than the original SimCity. As for DOSBox settings, once again it's simple stuff, just set cycles to max and you're good to go. Unlike the original SimCity, which didn't use a lot of processing power, SimCity 2000 uses quite a bit more, especially once you start to really fill the map up, so the max setting will ensure you get as little slowdown as possible as your cities get bigger. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. I was thinking of covering Rise of the Triad for episode 120 next week, but it seems like virtually everyone's talking about the game right now. And I'm a bit of a nonconformist. So, instead, I'm going to take a look at a game that has dragon punches and Hadoukens. And no, it's not a Street Fighter game. In fact, it's not even in the same genre. If you think you know which game it could be, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned to see what I've got in store. Thank you for watching the credits. Now go watch the credits in SC2K.